One receiver appears out, but another one could be coming in.
You are Locked On Syracuse, your daily podcast on the Syracuse Orange. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome into Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer, and thank you for making us your first listen of every single day here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It is your team every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And folks, on today's show, we are talking all about the wide receiver room for Syracuse football because last night we got two big pieces of information. One wide receiver that had previously been committed to Syracuse in the transfer portal decided to reopen his recruitment. But shortly after, we got a big piece of information that the Orange are expected to land a visit from an elite wide receiver from a team that was just in the college football playoff. So there's plenty to talk about and more here on this edition of Locked On Syracuse. And before we get to everything, this episode is brought to you by FanDuel. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Chris Long Jr., who had previously transferred from Rutgers to Syracuse in December. He would have been a veteran depth wide receiver for the Orange, decided to reopen his recruitment per himself. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that Chris Long is never going to be a member of the Syracuse Orange, but per himself, he's reopening his recruitment. That means he is going to listen to other teams at minimum. And I was kind of perplexed. I don't know why Chris Long decided to re-enter his name in the portal, or I guess, quote unquote, reopen his recruitment. It was kind of strange, don't you think? I thought it was strange. Until we got a big piece of news about an hour later. Not even, honestly. First on it was Matt Zenitz from 24/7 Sports. Syracuse football is expected to get a visit this weekend from Penn State starting wide receiver Omari Evans. And we'll talk more about Omari Evans in the next segment of this podcast. But the bottom line is this. He is a game-changing wide receiver. And Fran Brown, I hope you're listening. Obviously, Syracuse football is targeting him. I really hope that Syracuse football can land Omari Evans. The other teams that are involved expected to get visits as well. Texas Tech. And then On3 also reported that Tennessee and Washington are also expected to get visits for Omari Evans. Here's the deal. How did this all come to be about? Why is Syracuse football targeting him in the first place? How are they able to target him in the first place, right? Didn't the portal close? You might be asking yourself. Well, here's the deal. Penn State's season, sorry to any Penn State fans who stumbled upon this podcast who are watching or listening right now. Penn State's season ended last Thursday, all right? They were in the college football semifinal. They lost to Notre Dame. Because they got so deep into the college football season, Penn State's players, all of them, received a 5-day transfer portal extension, meaning they had 5 days between when the season ended to put their names in the transfer portal. This is very similar to how Syracuse football's players, right? When Syracuse football won their bowl game, after it, every player on the roster received a 5-day extension to enter the transfer portal. You want to know who used that? Center John Ray Reed. He used that 5-day extension, okay? And so Omari Evans decided to enter the portal on January 14th. So he is a very recent portal addition. This was not someone who has been on our radar for a very long time. He entered the portal 2 days ago. That's it, all right? At the time that you are watching or listening to this podcast, it is actually about exactly 48 hours after he entered the portal because it was in the evening of January 14th. Now, as far as team needs, On yesterday's show, I actually discussed that wide receiver is one of the few positions that doesn't really need to be touched for Syracuse football. And I said that in part because I like the foundation that they already have on the roster. And we're going to get to it at the end of the show, talking about the wide receiver room as is and what Omari Evans would do for the wide receiver room. But as it stands right now, I like Syracuse football's wide receivers. And feel free for you to chime in right now in the comments section below how you feel about Syracuse's wide receiver room. But I think it's pretty good. And I also thought to myself, well, Syracuse football has already made 2 additions to its wide receiver room, and they have other needs on the roster. So there's no real need to target anyone in the transfer portal, right? Well, right around the time that you might have been watching or listening to yesterday's full podcast about the offensive line is when Chris Long decided to reopen his recruitment, or at least make the news official, which opens a spot in Syracuse's wide receiver room. I still don't think that wide receiver is a big need for the Orange. I still don't think that, even though Chris Long decided to enter the portal. The reason is because when I viewed Chris Long, I thought he was more of a depth wide receiver option. And Syracuse football has a ton of depth right now at wide receiver. But because they have that open spot now, why not look to add a player in the portal? And there's also this school of logic here. You can never have enough weapons, ladies and gentlemen. There's no such thing as this team's got too many weapons. We're going to go over very soon about Penn State and where exactly Omari Evans played at Penn State. But I'll let you know right now, Penn State had a ton of weapons. And they got to the Final Four of college football. College football semifinal. It's kind of weird calling them the Final Four, but it is only 4 teams remaining. So you can never have enough weapons. And also, I would view Omari Evans as more of a elite wide receiver talent that Syracuse football can get. And you also don't say no to elite talent if that elite talent wants to play for you. You don't say no. You say yes, and you figure out where you're going to play him. So overall, one receiver in Chris Long appears to be out the door. He transferred to Syracuse from Rutgers, but he decided to reopen his recruitment. But not long after, we might have found out why that is. And that's because Omari Evans, per 24/7 Sports and On3, is expected to visit Syracuse this weekend. Other schools involved, Texas Tech, Washington, and Tennessee. Let's hope that Syracuse football can land Omari Evans, a starting wide receiver from Penn State. Could be a game changer. Coming up, I'm going to tell you guys a lot more about Omari Evans and why Syracuse football should pursue him next. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. That's $300 to keep the action going. The FanDuel app is easy to navigate, and the variety of bets keeps every game exciting. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. No waiting around for your winnings, whether you're betting on your favorite team or just looking to add some extra excitement to the playoffs. FanDuel has you covered. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $300 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Thank you for making Locked On Syracuse your first listen of every single day here on the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm Jackson Holzer. This podcast is free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And now let's go over Omari Evans and why I think he is a game-changing wide receiver that hopefully Syracuse football can land in the transfer portal. So here's a little bit about Omari Evans. Let's get the logistics out of the way, all right? The bio of him. Omari Evans is 6 foot, 190 pounds, and he's got 1 more year of college eligibility remaining. Evans is coming off his best season in college football. He played in all 16 games for Penn State. He had 21 catches for 415 yards and 5 touchdowns. He averaged nearly 20 yards per catch. More on that in just a moment, okay? So you might be asking yourself right now, why is this guy an elite game-changing wide receiver for Syracuse football? After all, I mean, come on, his stats, they don't jump off the page, right? I mean, 400 yards, 21 catches, 5 touchdowns. That's not overwhelming. But here's the deal. First of all, Omari Evans was the number 2 wide receiver at Penn State, meaning there was one wide receiver that was ahead of him on the depth chart, and that was Harrison Wallace, who had 46 catches for 720 yards and 4 touchdowns, which for a number 1 wide receiver in a full season like Penn State played, I believe Wallace played in 15 games of the 16, that's not a lot for a number 1 wide receiver. So why is it that the case? Neither of them really produced super highly considering where Penn State finished at the end of the year. I'll tell you why, all right? First of all, Penn State had the best tight end in the country on their team. I know you guys who are watching or listening to this, 99% of you are Syracuse Orange fans just like myself. There is a tight end in the country that is better than Oronde Gadsden. His name is Tyler Warren. He was the number 1 pass catcher on Penn State this season. He had over 1,000 yards, and I believe he had also over 100 catches. He was a target machine for Penn State. So he already is cutting into the volume of Omari Evans and also to their number 1 wide receiver, Harrison Wallace. Also, Penn State ran the football a ton. They had not 1 but 2 1,000-yard rushers on their roster. All this to say, rewind to what I said at the beginning of this podcast about you can never have too many weapons. Penn State had so many weapons on their roster last season. So while Omari Evans' numbers don't necessarily jump off the page, this is someone that if you put him in the right situation and you give him the right amount of targets, he could really explode in college football in 2025. He was a starting wide receiver for a team that made the college football semifinal. A starter, a number 2 wide receiver. That is significant. He might not have been, quote unquote, the guy, but he was certainly a guy, right? So overall, I think that he is a really, really good player, and he could be a game changer for Syracuse football. And also, if you're not convinced, keep in mind the other schools that are targeting Omari Evans in the transfer portal, right? It's not Syracuse versus 3 group of 5 schools. It's Syracuse and Washington. It's Syracuse and Texas Tech. It's Syracuse and Tennessee. If those 3 schools think he can play, who's to say that he can't, right? So overall, this is a really, really good player. As far as a scouting report on Omari Evans, okay? Omari Evans is an elite field-stretching wide receiver. This means that basically on any given play, he can score a touchdown. 2nd and 12 at your own 25-yard line, look out for Omari Evans because he can take it to the house. He can go 75 yards. He can just streak down the field. He has got elite speed. Evans is super valuable because teams have to respect that speed. They have to. This is going to cause a safety to have to drop back so that Omari Evans doesn't score that touchdown on 2nd and 12 from their own 25-yard line. And what does that do? It opens up the middle of the field. You think about what it can do for Syracuse, right? Think about all the guys that they could have next season. You have Omari Evans streaking down the field, which opens up the middle for arguably the best slot receiver now in college football, and Trebor Pena. Xavier Restrepo is out of eligibility and in the NFL draft from Miami. He might have been the best one this past season. And Darrell Gill and Jamie Tremble. Omari Evans opens up the middle of the field because of his speed and the fact that he is a field stretcher. It also is another reason why his numbers don't necessarily jump off the page, because field stretching wide receivers, they don't really thrive on volume. That's not the name of the game for them. They thrive on the fact that when they get that opportunity, when they get that look, it's usually a big play. Hence why Omari Evans averages over or nearly 20 yards per catch. That is huge. All right. An example for you all. We'll go to the NFL here, but also keep in mind this player was one of the best field stretchers at Alabama when he was in college. And I am by no means saying that Omari Evans is as good as this player. I'm not saying that at all. But it's meant to show you the profile of an elite, game-changing, field-stretching wide receiver. What I'm talking about here. Jameson Williams, currently with the Detroit Lions. All right. He had over 1,000 yards for the Lions this season. Over 1,000, but he did it on only 58 catches. That's not a lot. Most wide receivers in the NFL, if they want to hit 1,000 yards, they got to get at least 75 to 80 catches to do it. Williams did it on 58. So you got to be thinking to yourself, well, why doesn't Detroit target him more, right? He does so much when he gets the ball. Well, his value is really about opening up the middle of the field for guys like Amon-Ra St. Brown and Sam Laporta. I can't believe I said Laporta and Jahmyr Gibbs in the passing game as well. That's what Williams' job is. And when Detroit does throw him the football, it's usually good news because that means he did get open down the field and he's probably going to go for a big play. And he also only had 91 targets. So once again, I am not necessarily saying that Omari Evans is as good as Jameson Williams. He's not. All right. But that is meant to demonstrate that field stretching wide receivers do more value when they don't necessarily have the ball because they are opening up the field for everyone else to work underneath and over the middle. Think about what it can do for Syracuse again. Trebor Pena, Jamie Tremble, Darrell Gill. When Will Nixon is healthy, if he runs a route underneath, all of a sudden that safety isn't coming in. The safety has to respect the fact that Omari Evans can take the top off of defense and score a 75-yard touchdown on any given play. So overall, I really want Omari Evans to be a member of the Syracuse Orange football team in 2025. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I think this would be a game-changing receiver addition for the Orange. And coming up, to further demonstrate my point, we're going to talk about the hypothetical wide receiver room with Omari Evans in it. So stick with me here on Locked On Syracuse. This message is brought to you by Prizepicks, the place to get real money sports action. With over 10 million members and billions in winnings, Prizepicks has changed the game in daily fantasy sports, whether it's the playoffs or regular season. Prizepicks has made it easier than ever to win big while enjoying all the football action. Now it's playoff time, and there's no better way to get in on the action than with Prizepicks. Here's how it works. You simply pick more or less on at least two players, and if your picks hit, you can win up to 1,000 times your cash. Yes, that's right. 1,000 times your money just by making a few simple picks. For me, I'm all about the hot takes this season. This week on Prizepicks, I'm looking at Lamar Jackson for more than 250 yards and Travis Kelce for more than 70 yards. It's fun to predict and easy to play. Plus, with Prizepicks' flex play, you can still double your money even if one of your picks doesn't hit. And with the app, you get your winnings fast, sometimes in as little as 15 minutes. Ready to run your game this football season? Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONCollege to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's right, $50 just for playing. Don't wait. Take your game to the next level with Prizepicks. Prizepicks, run your game. If Syracuse football is fortunate enough to land Penn State starting wide receiver Omari Evans in the transfer portal, he instantly becomes the number one wide receiver on Syracuse football's depth chart. So let's go over the hypothetical wide receiver room. Let's say he visits this weekend and they don't let him leave the building until there is a deal in place, right? That's what I hope happens. I sincerely hope that happens, all right? The starting wide receivers, you have Omari Evans to stretch the field. You also got Darrell Gill. Darrell Gill, I have said many times here on this podcast, I think he is due for a big jump in year 3. He already took a big jump from year 1 to year 2 in college football. I think he's going to take an even bigger leap in year 3. And then you also got Trebor Pena, who I referenced in the last segment as arguably the best slot receiver in all of college football, especially because Xavier Restrepo from Miami is out of eligibility and is in the NFL draft. Trebor Pena arguably is now the best slot guy. On paper, Omari Evans, Darrell Gill, Trebor Pena, I don't know about you all, and you can tell me right now, I feel like that's a really good 1-2-3 punch. I feel that is a really, really good starting wide receiver room. Let me know in the comments section below, but that's enticing. I like it. Then the depth receivers, in no particular order. Here are some of the names to look out for, right? Emmanuel Ross, a 2024 4-star wide receiver for the Orange. He redshirted this past season. Who knows? Maybe he could take a big jump in his first full season in college football. After all, he was a 4-star recruit, right? Then you got Amari Hatcher. It's funny how we're talking about 2 Amaris here on the podcast. Amari Hatcher is a veteran deep threat wide receiver. Then you got Zeed Haynes. Zeed Haynes played in 2 games this past season. He looked decent in those 2 games, but then he had some personal issues and he missed the rest of the year. Now, all signs indicate that he's back with the team. He did not enter the transfer portal, at least during the fall window. We'll see if he enters it in the spring. Not to say that he will, but that would be another opportunity if he decided to, just like everyone else on the roster for the Orange. But as of right now, he's on the team. He is a former 4-star Georgia recruit in 2023. He redshirted his first season at Georgia. High hopes for him last season. He actually entered as the team's number 1 wide receiver before he missed the rest of the year. So Zeed Haynes, he goes from the starting wide receiver or the number 1 wide receiver for the Orange entering 2023 to probably a depth option to start next season if you get a guy like Omari Evans to commit to Syracuse. There's also Justice Ross Simmons, the Colorado State transfer, who in my opinion also entered last season potentially as a starting wide receiver, but he was dealing with a nagging hamstring injury towards the end of camp, which bled into the season. And by the time he even got healthy, there were too many receivers on the roster that had already emerged. So it was tough for a guy like Justice Ross Simmons to really carve out a role last season, but he was really good at Colorado State. And I had high hopes for him. Now, again, you get Omari Evans. He profiles more as a depth guy next year. And finally, you also got Tyshawn Russell, who Syracuse added in the transfer portal already from South Carolina, a low-risk, high-reward move. So overall, this wide receiver room with Omari Evans, it gets better at the top. And because it gets better at the top, it slides everyone down, which also increases the depth on the roster. If they get Omari Evans, it is essentially Omari Evans for Chris Long, who just opened up his recruitment after committing to Syracuse. I'll take that trade any day of the week. Anytime, anywhere. I'll take Omari Evans over Chris Long Jr. The unit would be deeper, and it would also be better at the top. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments section below. I'll leave off with this, all right? I don't think Syracuse football, quote unquote, needs Omari Evans. I would love if he joined the team. I would love it. But I don't think they need him because, like I said, they have so much depth already on the roster at wide receiver. So let's say Omari Evans does not commit. He goes to Texas Tech or Tennessee or Washington. The 2 starting wide receivers would be Darrell Gill and Trebor Pena, and then there would be 1 more open spot. And I think all 5 candidates that I mentioned as depth guys right now could take that spot and do more than a serviceable job, probably even much better than a serviceable job, in my opinion. So they don't need him, but it would certainly be an amazing addition for Syracuse football if they can get him. And since Chris Long already decided to reopen his recruitment, why not? They have the spot already ready for him. Why not look to add him? So Syracuse football expected to get a visit from potentially a game-changing wide receiver in Omari Evans. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. As far as what is coming up on the podcast in the future, tomorrow, so I was going to do originally today a full 2026 Syracuse football recruiting update, but I decided after the news that we heard last night to make this a mini podcast, but also move it to Friday. So it's a mini 2026 recruiting podcast tomorrow, and it's going to be about Syracuse football landing its 7th commit of the 2026 class, and also a 4-star defensive back put the Orange in his top 7. So we'll go over that and more in the mini podcast tomorrow about 2026 recruiting. And also tomorrow is Friday, which means it's Poll Friday. The question for this week was, how many Syracuse players do you think will be drafted in the 2025 NFL draft? I have a feeling it's going to be a good amount of players drafted. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that in the comments section below. I believe by the time you're watching or listening to this podcast, the voting is already closed for that. So that about does it for this edition of Locked On Syracuse. Thank you for making Locked On Syracuse your first listen today. For your second listen, check out the Locked On ACC podcast. Alex Dono and Kenton Gibbs, they keep it real and bring you the truth about where your favorite ACC team stands within the conference. You can find Locked On ACC on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Folks, thank you all so much for watching. Thank you all so much for listening. If you like this podcast, make sure to click that like button. And folks, if you really enjoy this podcast, make sure you hit that subscribe button and you turn on those notifications so you know right away when I am dropping the next podcast. And also, if you could be so kind and do me a favor, tell 1 or 2 of your closest Syracuse Orange friends about the Locked On Syracuse podcast so that this channel can grow and reach all Syracuse Orange fans. I will see you all again really soon, and let's hope that Omari Evans commits to Cuse.